afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kyle Hoepner and I'm very pleased to be talking today with a handful of our area's most dynamic and distinguished professionals in policy, urban planning, and design about designing the Boston people will love in the year 2121. And I will share my screen here if I can manage that without too much difficulty. There we go. Sort of being the tech person and running everything is always a little bit awkward, but forgive me for that. Come on. There we go. All right. Anyway, so to follow up on that, what are the smartest things we can do now to ensure that our city's public realm remains vibrant and livable into the next century? Before we jump in though, I would like to give some special thanks to Tony Fusco and Boston Design Week for making us a part of this year's lineup of great design events. And I hope all of you have taken full advantage of everything that's been going on in person and online for this past week and a half. I will mention now also that there will be some time toward the end of this session for audience questions. So at that point, if you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A button located down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Note that this is not the chat button, which won't work in this webinar. So please make sure to use the one marked Q&A and you'll be able to type in your questions and we will do our best to get to them. Given the interest that we've got in this, I can't guarantee that every single question will get answered before the end of our 90 minutes, but we will certainly do our best to accommodate you all. Next up, I would like to introduce the 5 wonderful professionals who have agreed to share their knowledge and insights with us today. So first up is Jonathan Greely, who is the Director of Development Review for the Boston Planning and Development Agency, where he oversees all real estate and development projects within the city of Boston. Since first joining the agency as an intern in 2005, Jonathan's work has included the implementation of the Roxbury Strategic Master Plan, the reinvigoration of Downtown Crossing, conceptualization of air rights development along the Massachusetts Turnpike, and long-term planning for the Fenway neighborhood, which, as we all know, has been changing greatly in recent decades. In recent years, he also contributed to the creation of a very hefty document called Imagine Boston 2030, which is actually, believe it or not, the first general plan for the city that has been produced since 1965. So that is some news. Next up is Ted Landsmark, whom all of you undoubtedly know. Ted is a distinguished professor of public policy and urban affairs at Northeastern University and serves as director of the university's Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. Before joining the Northeastern faculty, Ted led the Boston Architectural College for 17 years as its president and CEO. During the course of his career, he has amassed a wealth of expertise in architecture, urban design, civic leadership, architectural and construction law, and community advocacy. And he is particularly engaged with issues of diversity, environmental design, historic preservation, and community-based economic development. In addition to his post at Northeastern, Ted also serves as a board member for the Boston Planning and Development Agency. So we have a very good representation from the city government here today. Next, Laura Moret is a landscape architect and associate principal in the urban and campus studios at the multidisciplinary design and planning firm Sasaki. Her work has ranged from the design of public parks, streetscapes, and waterfronts to large-scale landscape planning and campus master planning. She has a particular interest in the design of vibrant urban spaces through an engaged public process and resilience planning for vulnerable communities. Laura also maintains close connections to academia and research, having taught in recent years at the Rhode Island School of Design, Northeastern University, and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And something I think that's especially relevant for today's topic, in 2015, Laura led the development of a collaborative research initiative and exhibition that was called Emerald Networks, Reviving the Legacy of City Parks. And so I'm sure Laura, some of that's going to come up with us today. Interim Deputy Director for the Downtown and Neighborhood Planning, Kenan Ryan, is the project lead for the Boston Planning and Development Agency's ongoing initiative, Plan Downtown. As the BPDA's planner for the downtown, Greenway/waterfront, Midtown Cultural District, and West End neighborhoods, she manages planning initiatives, researches and prepares zoning recommendations, and provides a planning perspective for the agency's Development Review Department. She also engages with the community and other constituencies to solicit input and feedback. Before joining the BPDA in 2018, Kenan held planning and design positions with UTIL, Over Under, and several other architectural firms. She has been an adjunct professor at the Wentworth Institute of Technology and has also served as a lecturer for Northeastern University and Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Andres Sevcuk is Associate Professor of Urban Science and Planning at MIT, where he also leads the Institute's City Form Lab. His work bridges urban design, active mobility, and spatial analysis technology. Andres is the author of the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox, which is used by researchers and practitioners around the world to model pedestrian flows along city streets and to study coordinated land use and transportation development along networks. He also has a recently published book, Street Commerce: Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks, which is a part of the series, The City in the 21st Century, from the University of Pennsylvania Press. And finally, you have myself as moderator this afternoon. I am a Boston-based writer, photo stylist, and editorial strategist who has been involved in design and publishing for more than 3 decades. I served as editor-in-chief for New England Home magazine, which is a local high-end residential design magazine, for 11 years, from 2008 to 2019. And most recently, I've opened a freelance consultancy to help home design brands present themselves in a compelling way and connect more effectively with the world at large. So, to our speakers, my sincere thanks to all 5 of you for coming to chat this afternoon. And now to get things started, I will jump in and just say, Boston is enormously lucky to have a hefty trove of beloved neighborhoods and public spaces that have been bequeathed to us by the past. Many of them, I would say, dating from the 19th century or sometimes even earlier, places like Boston Common. And these are certainly one reason Boston is frequently ranked as one of the best places to live in the US. And in 2019, we won't talk about 2020, unfortunately, the Greater Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau logged a total of 19.87 million domestic visitors and 2.88 million international visitors, many of whom undoubtedly came in part to experience places like Newbury Street and Copley Square and many others that you can think of. So our question for this afternoon is, given the wave of development that has taken place in recent years and seems to be continuing, are we creating neighborhoods and public amenities of the same quality that will continue to make Boston a great place to live and attract visitors for many decades into the future? And for that matter, what is it that makes people want to spend time in different areas of a city? What qualities distinguish the neighborhoods, streetscapes, parks, and other attractions that consistently promote indoor and outdoor public life decade after decade? Or to put it in more official terminology for our technical-minded folks, what makes a great public realm? And are we doing the best job we can possibly do with that here in Boston? So with that charge, I will jump in with a general question to all of you. Just to start off with, what are the public aspects of the city of Boston and its surrounding area that you and other people you know love particularly?
I can start.
There have to be some. Somebody jump in.
I mean, I think on a personal level, one of the great spaces that I've really enjoyed, it's actually a network of spaces. So the Emerald Necklace, as we all know, and the Esplanade, I think that's one of the key features that distinguishes us from, I guess you could say, a travel perspective. Why people visit us is our great open space network. But I would add to that, the harbor is an amazing space. And I think what's also unique about the city is we have very different types of open spaces. And when you leave Boston proper, there's a lot of amazing resources as well, especially along the waterfront, that complement the more urban spaces.
That's great.
Well, I'll just add that for me, the most interesting urban spaces are those that impart a sense of magic and wonder and surprise when one transits them. They're sometimes about design, but they're mostly about how they're experienced. And in a city like Boston, unlike San Diego or other places where the weather doesn't change very much, they need to be places that are accessible and magical really throughout the year. And so certainly the Emerald Necklace achieves that. Spending time along the Charles or along the waterfront achieves that. There are Newbury Street achieves that. And it also has to be remembered that Boston is as much a concept as it is a political geography. And by that, I mean when residents or long-term visitors to the city say they've been to Boston, sometimes what they really mean is that they spent time in Cambridge or in adjacent communities. When one is outside of Boston, the sense of Boston is that it's really a regional concept. And I think that part of what we need to think about into the future is how we make the entire region, with Boston as a hub or center of some of that, how we make the entire region accessible to a very large range of people who are looking for that kind of spatial magic.
Absolutely. I think that's a great observation, Ted. And I certainly agree about the regionality of it. I think particularly for you guys and our listeners who may not have lived outside of the Northeast, but for a lot of people in other parts of the US, cities are essentially concentrated areas that are surrounded by kind of unincorporated area. And so especially coming to a place like Massachusetts, where when you leave one town, you're immediately in another one and everything is all crowded together. That's not the way a lot of people experience sort of urbanism versus non-urbanism in the rest of the country. And so that, I think, Ted, may lead to some of the impression that you were talking about, where people don't, and even we who live here don't really distinguish necessarily between exactly Boston and its surrounding communities, because it is all one metropolitan area and it is all kind of one organism in terms of those things. Jonathan, I think you might want to chat with us about this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Cannon took all the good ones, but I think for me, I would just say I've spent the last 10 years living on the ComAv Mall, and not actually on the mall adjacent to it, but and one of the things that I love is the seasonality of that space and how it feels very differently. It's framed beautifully by the ComAv Boulevard and the homes on either side. But there's, when the lights go on around the holidays, it changes the space. When the leaves start to bloom on the various trees up and down the mall, it changes the space. When the trees overhead are fully green, it changes the space, right? And so how that space evolves seasonally is something I care about and feel passionately about. What has been really interesting is over the past year, I think people are rediscovering their city in different ways, and having watched people now have fitness classes and dog meetups and dinner in ways that never happened before, or maybe only occasionally did, has been really, really compelling. And then that's my favorite space. I would also offer, I'm in the process of moving after a number of years to the Back Bay to Charlestown, and I have discovered the North Point Park, kind of underneath the Zachem, and watching that park evolve. You've got this vibrant skate park scene. You've got all this new open space. You've got people biking through that amazing ped bike bridge. But what's cool there is watching the rhythms evolve clearly, that people are constantly discovering that park and what it means to them, and seeing how that is working is kind of really, really cool. And so I would just say that for me, it's this bookend of this well-established stately Boston image of ComAv Mall, but also seeing this new space in kind of forgotten zone, seeing that evolve as well. And so I think that's the Ted, what struck me is your idea of Boston as an idea as much as a collection of neighborhoods, and seeing our ability for some of these things to evolve over time, and see renewal in spaces that were maybe long forgotten, is very, very cool. So those are my two favorite spaces at the moment.
No, that's great. And I think, Jonathan, that particular park may come back up later because it may be a really wonderful example of cities basically taking advantage of underutilized spaces or kind of deserted spaces that have been in there, very much like the High Line in New York, which made a wonderful place out of something that had been kind of derelict. And that, for Boston, that park is an example of that. Andres, I think you wanted to chat a little bit about this also. You'll have to unmute yourself, however.
Yes,
there you go.
Sure. I wanted to make sure that we add neighborhoods to the list. I mean, for me, there are big civic projects that are the pride of Boston historically, the big parks, the big monuments, the public library, such interventions, even bridges of the sorts. But I think there's a whole other level in which Boston is known, which is only revealed through its neighborhoods, which all have a distinct character, whether it's Chinatown or South End or Roxbury or Cambridge, which you could call part of Boston and so forth. And I think there's this unusually distinct delineation of those in Boston's spatial structure, more so than in most American cities. If you look at the satellite photo of Boston, you can almost just draw out the neighborhoods, and then you walk into them and they reveal urbanisms of America, right? And I think this was really important that you mentioned, I think, Kyle, already earlier, that globally, US is sort of known for American urbanism, which is associated with post-Second World War shopping malls and cars and stuff. Boston is a prime example of demonstrating that there is a multitude of urbanisms, and they are always driven by people who come and create cities and leave their trace, either in building typologies, in amenities and businesses they generate, in various other ways. And I think this is one of, for me, the biggest qualities that Boston has, this diversity of historic neighborhoods that keeps changing over time.
Yeah. No, that's go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to build on that and say, I think I echo a lot of what's been said in terms of this incredible diversity of spaces that exist, both through, the downtown and these neighborhoods. When I was in, school studying landscape architecture, I had the chance to tour the Emerald Necklace, and these were a lot of the spaces that I was more familiar with. But, recently doing some work in East Boston and Charlestown, I think it's been incredible, especially, in East Boston, to discover we have this incredible beach in the city. We have, the Belle Isle Marsh that is this, it resonates what you're saying, Ted, about a magical space, that it really feels like a completely different world from the city, and the opportunity to see it changing through the seasons. I think just the ability to access this range of spaces within the urban environment is so unique, and it's part of what's kept me in Boston now for 20 plus years.
Thanks. Well, Kenan, you want to add more to your list? Or are you still good with
There's too many to add in reality. But I would say, I think what was interesting about hearing everybody's responses was thinking about how this really seems like the open spaces in public realm are more of a social infrastructure for the city. So, starting with, what I first listed, those were physical infrastructure solving, a lot of flooding concerns at the time. But I think some of the best spaces we're hearing here are serving dual purposes. They're serving the purposes for the communities within for health and wellness. In some cases, we're hearing spaces that are serving more of an economic use, right? How do we support small businesses, for example, in urban spaces? And so I think that's really what makes Boston unique is they always have this dual purpose. It's not just a passive space. It's a space that's also serving the neighborhood in a very unique way.
Oh, that's an awesome point. And actually, when we asked people to sign up for this webinar, we did ask a few questions we asked everybody to list what some of their favorite spaces in Boston. And so I'll just we've talked about several of them already since a lot of people share them, but I think the list actually reflects exactly what we've just been saying, because they are spaces of many different characters, and some of them are parks, and some of them are commercial areas, and some of them are neighborhoods. And so the public garden is an obvious one. The Esplanade, which we've already talked about, although one person did say in capital letters minus Storrow Drive and Memorial Drive. The Rose Kennedy Greenway, the Arboretum, Newbury Street, Post Office Square, Downtown Crossing, Center Street in Jamaica Plain has just an area to kind of hang out. Cambridge Common, Peters Park in the South End. And somebody said both of those things have a really diverse set of activities and users. The Common, Harbor Walk, Charles Street, Dorchester Avenue, Faneuil Hall, Boston Harbor and Islands, the Neponset River Greenway, the Freedom Trail, Martin's Park in the Seaport outside the Children's Museum, Boston Common, and Beacon Hill. And so one thing that comes to my mind with that rather long list, which is how did these wonderful things actually come about, historically speaking? What made them possible? So anybody who wants to jump on that is good.
Well, certainly some of the places came about through concerted planning. We're coming up on a celebration of Frederick Law Olmsted's planning in Boston. That'll be in another year or two. And certainly we've looked to those kinds of large-scale planning initiatives, whether it was filling in the Back Bay or creating the Emerald Necklace. But it also has to be remembered that much of that planning work at a large scale was really about resilience and sustainability. Much of Olmsted's work initially was really about dealing with sewage treatment and water management and a lot of other infrastructure improvements. The filling in of the Back Bay, for example, required tearing down a mountain and dumping it in marshland in order to create, among other things, real estate development opportunities. And then I would also say that a lot of the joy that comes from many of the neighborhoods comes about because Boston has always been a destination for immigrants and very diverse people. In fact, we are, in terms of our footprint, a very small city. We're smaller than Brooklyn and Queens together, and our population is only 1/4 the population of Brooklyn's. But we bring together a very, very diverse range of people and have done so for a couple of centuries. And as people have moved into the neighborhoods, they've created excitement within those neighborhoods that has distinguished those neighborhoods. So Nubian Square is certainly not the same as Mattapan Square or Maverick Square. They've all developed over the years individual characters that both have to deal with space planning, but also with the ethnicity and diversity of the people who've lived in those neighborhoods.
Yeah. I would maybe comment on two additional factors that have contributed to the evolutions of Boston's urban form and character. I think the fact that it had the oldest T in America and that it has grown gradually and connected up places, whether by streetcar and later subway, has been instrumental in catalyzing private sector development and growth in housing and commercial development in many of the areas. And that's something that we can come back to when we talk about our hopes for what gets funded and done in the next century and how the city might look like. I think is worth returning to. And then second, from an urbanistic perspective, it's a common trait across cities around the world is that as time goes on, developers get access to more and more credit, bigger loans, and bigger development projects. And in fact, if we look historically at Boston, the fine grain of neighborhood characteristics and structures, the pretty small footprint buildings that many people like about Boston's history are no longer necessarily what we do now, because now a developer can borrow that much capital that typically one building is one block. That's our new template, rather than having a block filled with 25 buildings as we used to. And I think that the kind of texture or character of urban structure that we've gotten in the past that has to do with the bigger sort of political economy of how development also worked in the past, and it may not be the same anymore.
No, I think that's an awesome point, Andres. And it actually, just what you said, I mean, brings to mind, I think we've all experienced that in what's been going on in the West End and Fenway and the South End along Harrison Avenue, and all of the Seaport, for example, has been this kind of new scale of development in what are basically turning into kind of new neighborhoods in ways that they hadn't existed before. And so that, for me, brings up a larger question, which is, what in fact are the elements that make for a vibrant experience or a vibrant streetscape in the parts of community where people gravitate to eat and shop and hang out and find entertainment? Are these things that can happen in small scale developments as well as large, or are the challenges different? Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
So maybe I'll half answer this and half touch on what Andres just said, because I think one of the challenges we're going to have as a city going forward is that I think a lot of the question has been about scale vertically. All of a sudden, the dominant land use proposal is a life sciences R&D lab typology. Boston succeeds, I think, because we have this awesome mix of old and new, and in scale, right? But all of a sudden, this new typology is very block driven in very, very heavy buildings. I then would say that what makes for a dynamic neighborhood is very frequently people. And so I think we have to remember, how do we find ways to make sure that our land use matches our aspirations for the public realm? And so as we consider and evaluate proposals every single day, we try to encourage people to think about their spaces as generators of activity. And we've got to find a way to balance that, is that it's not that a big lab building can't exist next to a really dynamic outdoor space. It's that it's also not just manifest destiny that they coexist together well. And we've got to find a way to do that and be really, really cognizant. Okay, we can introduce and consider this new dominant typology, but we've got to be really, really careful about what the first 30, 40 feet of that building is, looks like, feels, contributes, and balances out everything else around it. And so it's not that lots of things can't coexist. It's that Boston has a pretty good history of helping them coexist, but that it has to remember that it's not an invisible hand, it's a very overt hand.
Great. Anybody else want to jump on that? I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say a great textbook example of this challenge, I think, has been technically outside of Boston, but I think we all agree greater Boston, Kendall Square. You'd have massive buildings, and for a very long time, developers not really interested in making that vibrant street front or urban scape around them, just because they make all their money upstairs, and who cares if they lose $20,000 on the ground floor? They just don't bother, right? And I think it, as Jonathan just said, it really takes public intervention to go in and say, these are the rules. You have to actually redo this, or you have to zone differently when we build new. And I think as the city, as we're sort of further maturing and creating layer upon layer upon layer of history. And now we're dealing with this biotech boom and very large capital landing in real estate. It's important to have equally strong urban design guidelines to ensure that that capital creates a publicly appealing urban realm around it. And I think the bigger growth means bigger responsibility in turning twisting the arm of the developer behind that growth, because many cities in other countries have experienced that too, right? And that have developed urban design regulations and guidelines that really are in place to channel that growth into a great public realm.
Right. I actually, not to jump in again, although I tend to do that by nature. So, I would argue two things kind of that on that score that I hope will lead to some more discussion. One is I wonder if it's not just a development and zoning kind of thing, because certainly you can require people to put certain things in the bottoms of their buildings. And what happens usually in those cases, it's almost always sort of retail and food and things like that. But I would ask about, some of the things that when I think about our older, more developed neighborhoods and the places where people have lived for a long time and that feel very successful, there are all these little interstitial places and users that exist, like pizza shops and dry cleaners and laundromats and hardware stores and pet stores and markets and preschools and all those things that people actually need to exist. And I don't know that any of those things are really accommodated under our current development rules. Usually the things that have been happening in a lot of these big things in Boston is we're putting in, a theater in a building in the Fenway for the theater offensive because it was a building that had some pre-existing use by the gay and lesbian community, which is all good. But what about the livability aspects of what are people who are actually congregating in those areas and living around them going to need? And that was a long-winded thing. Second, I'd love to talk, especially with some of our development people, including Kenan. Is there a different methodology for making a vibrant kind of streetscape that is primarily housed only in the bottom floors of large buildings, as opposed to the older parts of Boston where there are lots of small buildings, cheek by jowl, or a combination of some large buildings with other little infill building around it? So Kenan or anybody else who wants to address that, feel free.
I can start maybe more with the first question, which leads out of the last discussion. I think, one approach that at least our department takes, because we're often doing the citywide planning initiatives, so we work at a neighborhood level to get an understanding before developers come in, is that a lot of residents and business owners, any constituent, is more concerned with the qualitative issues than they are necessarily with the design issues, you could say. And so we often hear concerns about things like affordability, how a public space can better serve them, how do they get to their jobs, that kind of framework. And so we're often trying to come up with recommendations that can then be legible and understandable to the design community and to the development community, because I think that's where our expertise comes in as a planning agency. We do have those backgrounds, so we can tie together some of those qualitative concerns. With those, I think, the case that you're mentioning, right, of kind of ground floor use is a particularly challenging one, because I think the default is often to over retail our ground floors in locations where it may not be the most appropriate. And so we're often trying to hear from our constituents, what are the types of retail establishments you want to see, so that we can right size the scale of those when a developer comes to the table. I think, another thing we're really trying to get a better handle on through our planning initiatives is also how do we better use the public realm, including the transportation network, to better serve our residents. And so one of the challenges we often face as well is, who is being served by these spaces. I think that's actually most important. There's the immediate neighborhood, but there's also the city in general. And so a lot of times, at least the way we're approaching this, is we're thinking about the development proposals coming to the table. how are you creating jobs at different educational attainment levels, for example? How are you serving different income populations through your affordable housing approach? Kind of a more nuanced approach that we get a better understanding of, like how that project can fit into the context of the neighborhood and serve the broader Boston community and the neighborhood.
Yeah, just to build on that, we've been working on the Fort Point 100 acres open space plan with BPDA. And I think a lot of the strategies there illustrate a lot of what y'all are saying, which is really this idea that you have to sort of get ahead of it and look at the district level and plan for that kind of range of open spaces that support, the future development. So we were looking at, what is the sort of ecosystem of different activities, different types of spaces, different qualities? How does it relate to what's in the broader context? And then I think something that was really smart about the way this plan was set up was that it also linked with a ground floor use study that was particular to the Chapter 91 spaces that are, meant to provide public amenity along the waterfront. But it was really looking at that interaction between the ground floor use that is truly public and the open spaces and parks that are truly public, even if parts of them are built by developers. So I think setting that framework in advance really helps to ensure that that these spaces will be for the public and not just the immediate neighbors, but for greater Boston as well.
Yeah, for me, the question is, who is the public that we want using these multiple spaces? I have always been struck by a comment that was made to me a number of years ago by a teenager who, when asked why they didn't go into downtown, as many teenagers don't go into downtown now, answered, well, there's no place to go to the bathroom. For people over a certain age, if you need to use a facility, that you can duck into a restaurant or a bar or someplace, and there's a facility there. But if you're 15 or 16 years old and you're thinking, wouldn't it be nice to go down to the waterfront and hang out on the waterfront for a while, there's no safe place to go for certain types of very basic needs. I had a student in a crit at the Bauhaus once who made a point of drawing a pregnant woman into every one of her renderings, because she felt that if designers thought about the needs of young pregnant women, that they were really thinking about the needs of people in wheelchairs. They were thinking about mobility issues. They were thinking about a range of other issues. And as long as we're designing in a way that implicitly excludes certain categories of users from the public that we say we're serving, then inevitably we're going to perpetuate a kind of class and gender and age and mobility segregation in the city. So that what we've done up to now to just build in the kinds of retail, for example, in many of our larger buildings that really doesn't welcome a range of people, inevitably means that the public realm has to have certain factors built into it that really do make a neighborhood and a public space feel welcoming to everyone in the public, and not only to a certain class of working people.
Yeah, I want to add to this too, from a income inequality perspective. Kyle, your very basic question of how do we ensure that a local pizza shop or a locally owned diner could exist in one of these newly developed areas, whether it's Dot Avenue or Seaport or any of those. I think we also lack policy tools to ensure something like inclusionary commercial space. We figured out how to do inclusionary housing, and that's an innovation of the 20th century. But, and that's not figured out. I wouldn't want to say we're doing well on this front. I feel we fall far short for where we should be. But we do not have equivalent policy tools on the table that have succeeded for inclusionary retail space And I think we need something like that if we want to assure that there will be places in cities that can house locally owned, beloved businesses that are not going to generate enough profit to pay the rent in those locations. There are some available. For instance, City of San Francisco has Measure JJJ, I think, which is a this historic legacy business tool where communities can rally their businesses to be on the city's legacy business list, and then if you're on the list, then the city provides subsidies. But those are arguably they work when the economy does well. I'm not sure whether these subsidies will still be there when the economy is not working so well in San Francisco. But I do think in overall, we do need to innovate policy tools that retains that economic vibrancy and diversity as well.
Yeah. Jonathan, did you want to speak to this from?
Yeah, I would just say thoroughly agree. We've dabbled in that, and it's tricky, right? And then also then you end up in this debate. You never want to have to choose between more inclusionary development units for housing versus commercial, et cetera. And I think so. I think one of the things is there's two things. I think some of this can be solved with design, making sure that there are small spaces that have adjacent outdoor areas, right? That allow the use to spill out. So there are some design solutions at the beginning. I also wonder, and I've often, this is a corner I've been on for a little while, when you talk to developers, and I do hope the last year has taught all of us to realize that the ground floor, in my mind, shouldn't be viewed just as a revenue generator on its own. It's about placemaking and driving revenue above. Right. So if you're saying to a developer, look, your value is in your lab building, your office building, your condo building, your rental building, whatever it is above, but you don't say, meet me at the apartment building. You say, yeah, meet me at the Sweet Green or meet me at the local restaurant, whatever it is. And that's what drives place. Right. And so how do we do two things? One, meet the challenge that Andres just articulated that I fully agree with, and identify funding sources and approaches, et cetera. But then also, how do we make sure that we are designing the ground floor of buildings so that they can match that challenge? And I think I just want to elevate that as equally important.
No, I think that's all good. Kind of looking at what we've just been talking about, I mean, it occurs to me that the same problem, or the same issue, I should say, not to be too negative about it, is, I think, embodied at a somewhat larger level in terms of, in Boston, kind of where all of the development attention and where all of the park renovations and things are actually happening. Because, what about kind of reinserting really vibrant commercial areas and green spaces and stuff into neighborhoods that historically were overlooked? It's like, why shouldn't Nubian Square be just as vibrant and just as beautiful as Harvard Square in Cambridge, or something that really does act as a community center like Roslindale Village or something like that, and actually has some intentionally beautifully developed green space along with a lot of small businesses that have been attracted around it. What about large stretches of Dorchester that don't really have parks, but meanwhile we're redoing Copley Square and we're redoing the City Hall Plaza, which is great, and we're doing places like the Piers Park in East Boston, and we're looking at a lot of new park area in along Fort Point Channel, which is all great. But again, those are all neighborhoods that are already very privileged and have lots of businesses and lots of very affluent people living in them. And so, to further Andres's point about the need for, I guess, to use a bad word, remedial kind of funding and consideration, can we do that at a larger level in the community? Not just focusing on the downtown and central area, but the sort of other communities that could use a real heart of some sort.
It's very interesting that you bring up Nubian Square, because I'm working with students who've been raising the question of why it is that Nubian Square, which is basically midway between Brigham Circle and Upham's Corner, is relatively underutilized as a retail center, even though it has one of the most active transit hubs within the region. Brigham Circle is alive, and Upham's Corner is alive with all kinds of activity. And yet Nubian Square, which is right in the middle and which has benefited from decades of public investment, languishes. And part of that relates to economic development issues, but part of it does relate to planning and to design issues and to the ways in which we create in those spaces, places where people want to linger, places where people feel comfortable and safe, places where families feel that they want to spend time rather than simply passing through for a retail transaction. And I think that's where both public policy making and design intersect in ways that support the efforts of local residents and local business people to maintain a level of vitality, not just during the daytime, but 15, 18 hours a day as needed, because increasingly, as we've realized, as Boston has become more global, and as we've learned from the pandemic, people want to be out at all hours of the day and night to the extent that they can. And they want to get all kinds of services at all hours of the day and night. And that's where our urban nodes become really important in terms of meeting the needs and aspirations of people and of visitors, and policy and planning help to facilitate that.
Great.
Ted, it strikes me that one thing maybe it's like, how do we create pause points? And a pause point can be a big bucket. And a pause point is a park bench, or it's a 2-hour dinner at a restaurant, and everything in between, right? And so when we think about neighborhood design and we think about node design, it's about how do we think about creating pause points, whereas you are not running by, you want to stop, you want to linger, you want to participate. And that can be everything in between. So I think it's in making sure that we've got lots of neighborhoods that have that in abundance. We've got other neighborhoods that don't, and why? And some of that is inherently disinvestment, legacy issues, design issues, but focusing on making sure that we have a wide range of pause points across cities, across neighborhoods, and across typologies. And I think that's the challenge. And I think this past year has almost exposed it and unlocked a new set of toolkits, but it also has exposed how much it's needed equitably across the city.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think, a lot of the work I've been doing relates to resilience planning, both in terms of coastal resilience and heat. And I think, we're looking in the neighborhoods across the city, and I think there's such an opportunity as we think about interventions, whether it's along urban streets to increase the canopy and help with, heat mitigation, or whether it's, a new coastline that takes a new form, through all the neighborhoods of Boston. How can we be thinking about more equitably distributed amenities, parks, open spaces that are also co-benefit and create this resilience for the future? I think it's, we're at the cusp of a lot of opportunity in terms of implementing those spaces.
I should probably speak more to BPDA planning, but there's an ongoing planning process I want to mention, just because you said that, Laura, which is the Parcel priority project that's run by the Boston Parks Department. And that is one of the issues they're looking at, right? They're looking across all of the neighborhoods to see where there are lacks of amenities and types of open spaces and variety. And they're getting feedback from residents across the city. And I think, what I love about this project is it's looking at where have we missed? We have these amazing infrastructural open spaces that we've mentioned, these giant networks, but there are places that we've missed historically, and this is an opportunity to start to address that, and for the city to start to build these smaller spaces and supplement, what's actually needed by residents in those locations.
Yeah, the other question that occurs to me, particularly with the group that is on this conversation, is how do we facilitate more of the kind of interdepartmental and interstitial planning that can really activate what community residents may want and need. To what extent do we at the BPDA, for example, engage in conversations with Massport or with the Parks Department or with the City of Cambridge or with the MBTA? We tend to have more of a public face than many of the other city and state and regional agencies. And so I know that we're hearing a lot and doing the best we can to translate that into policies and practices. But much of what we do has to inevitably interface with parks and streets and transportation, with access for wheelchairs and with state agencies. And I know that it's often confusing to people in the communities and to planners and architects and landscape architects as to how one really goes about initiating and pursuing a conversation that will require the collaboration of multiple agencies in order to achieve a really outstanding outcome. We know that we can get together to achieve levels of mediocrity, but the question is, how do we get together to achieve, the kind of excellence that we've seen in other planning efforts historically?
I think that's a great question, Ted. And it actually, I think it leads into another question, which is very closely related, which is, how in fact, and this is probably maybe first to Jonathan, because this is right in the heart of your job in a way, how does development actually happen in Boston? Are all projects proposed by private developers and then the city and other agencies have to react to that and then do their best to, after the fact, build in what the public wants and needs? Is it always sort of an adversarial thing? How does that really tend to work? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but
I mean, everybody else can go home. Everybody else pull up a seat. We'll talk for the next 4 hours. I think there is no one way, right? And so at a very basic level, the BPDA responds to private development, right? Which is often responding to market conditions and sometimes responding to actual human need, right? I think, and then if you zoom out, that is also ideally happening within some version of a planning context, whether it's a macro plan like Imagine Boston 2030, a legacy plan like the Fenway rezoning that has allowed the transformation of Boylston Street, but preserved the Queensbury Peterborough blocks south of it, an ongoing planning study like the one Kennan's leading in downtown, or a community dialogue that is being held around Zoom kitchen tables in civic associations throughout the city. And so, and then you also have the element of kind of political discourse of be it mayors, be it local electeds, be it state electeds, and sometimes federally elected officials kind of weighing in on different priorities. And so that backdrop is what we are ultimately trying to suss out and guide developers along those ways. Some developers have a very strong sense of what they want to do and have done the homework about, hey, we recognize we are investing in a neighborhood and we're essentially asking to be part of a neighborhood, either a long-term and a short-term sense. Other developers have to be led along the way and have to be made aware of the context, both physically, socially, historically, that they're entering into. And even most recently, this year, we've added in the layer of a fair housing layer, talking about historical displacement and how we got here, and acknowledging that how we got here isn't necessarily this benevolent outcome. Oftentimes, the private sector and government sector conspired to create some of the inequalities that we are often now grappling with today. And so when you say, how does development happen? All of those things are inputs. And for better or for worse, myself and Kenan spent a lot of time thinking about this, and then ultimately pitching those things to our board, and Ted is a member of our board, and that then adjudicates that. And so, and it's not complicated. It's not easy. It's very, very complicated. And you're trying all the time to have a big picture vision of a thriving future city that, and I keep on coming back to the idea that Ted said in the beginning, that Boston is an idea just as much of it is an actual place. And it's our job to kind of constantly tweak that, update that, et cetera. I think of us as in-house consultancy to the city of Boston, to the mayor of Boston, to help them achieve their vision. And hopefully we have a role in charting that. And so I think maybe that's the best kind of murky answer I can give. But I would just say it takes a village to kind of help this village evolve, right? In a wide range of private actors, public actors, and everything in between.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that outline, Jonathan, and I think it's really helpful because I, as long as I've lived in Boston, and I think maybe a lot of our listeners have never really quite known like how these things come up. And I think, one of the things I was hearing from Ted just a few minutes ago, and Ted, forgive me if I'm misinterpreting you, but I think he was almost calling for something that I would ask, which is are there ways that the public and the city and other towns and villages and around us could be more proactive in a way in this system, and maybe look at a place like Nubian Square or some other area and sort of say, well, here's what this neighborhood really needs. And then go out and actually, rather than waiting for private developers to come with a project, go out and find or recruit developers of relevant different scales to do various different things in that area. I mean, is that completely out of the possibility? I mean, anybody who wants to chat about that?
Well, it's my view that is a real possibility. It has significant challenges built into it. And by that, I mean, most specifically, Boston is growing at this moment because people look at the city internally and externally with optimism and hope. When immigrants arrive here, it's because they think that their lives are going to be better here than they were somewhere else. And so they arrive with a kind of optimism. The city's population has gone up by something like 50,000 people over the last half dozen years. I mean, that's tremendous population growth. When students attend college here and then decide that they want to stay, right? They're not staying because Boston is a default situation. They stay because they think that their prospects for growing and having a family and having a career are good. So we need to think optimistically about what it is that we want. And I would submit that to a large extent, we may be spending an inordinate amount of time looking backwards at missteps or misdeeds, mistakes that have been made in the planning process or in the policy development process. We want to correct the things that went wrong in the past. And of course, we need to do that. But we also need to be able to lay out a vision of what it is we think we want to be in 2030 and in 2120. We need to express our imagination about what the community can become. And that means negotiating between existing communities that are struggling to protect the status quo, sometimes positively and sometimes not so positively, right? We're very critical of NIMBYism in the suburbs, but not so critical of NIMBYism when it comes up from within one of our core Boston communities that says it doesn't want to change, right? So the question is, how do we project a future for what a particular neighborhood or community can be in a way that recognizes that communities do change and that there's going to be some level of gentrification in neighborhoods around the city, driven more by market forces than by someone's effort to destroy a community. The question is, when that happens, how does a community share in the benefits that arise from rising economic prospects in that neighborhood? And so that means constantly hearing and discerning and negotiating what the future is going to be in a hopeful and optimistic way, because no one is projecting that this city is about to shrink. I mean, the edges might around resilience and the waterfront, but no one is projecting that this city is going to be smaller in the future than it is at this moment. And that means really thinking about what it means to have more people and more resources available to people, and a vision for what we want Boston to be moving forward.
Right. And potentially without displacing the less advantaged people who are already in the neighborhoods.
Exactly.
I would like to add to this
Go ahead.
that now I fully agree with what Ted just said. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that we're having this discussion of forward-looking planning by the public sector at the kind of tail end of decades of neoliberal growth in America. You know, at the tail end of, you know, what started even before Reaganism, but, you know, we've systemically dismantled public sector powers in this country, right? And now sort of we're at a point where the role of public sector is almost self-evidently approving just private sector initiatives. And that's kind of the role of planning in many agencies. But I think it's important to maybe start questioning that. And I think we're seeing some hopeful signals from the current administration to rethink what public sector might mean in the 21st century US. And I think it's important that when we find the policy tools to bring in public sector projects again. And I think having a citywide master plan is a great step in that direction, right? We need to have a plan in order to fulfill some ideas and start putting things in. That's it. I think when we do that in the 21st century, these public investments into place and public spheres have to come along with equally strong protections and tools for equitable distribution of their benefits, right? So even if we think back to when the public library was built in Boston, that didn't come along with affordable housing provisions alongside, or affordable business protections alongside, or other things. And we've done that in the past, and similar issues have been, you know, fought historically. Gentrification just became a word in the 20th century, but it was always present before that too. And I think we just have to find a model moving forward that these public investments into placemaking come systemically with housing protections, not just new housing additions, but either affordable, or I would even love to see more publicly delivered housing units that level the playing ground to some extent. But I think I'd like to see a model moving forward where investment into place comes already with some safeguards to equitable distribution, and that will be far better accepted, and we can all kind of feel that that's hopefully going to help distribute these goods equitably.
Yeah, no, I think that's an awesome point. And it actually, I mean, Laura, I'd love to hear a little more from you and Kenan, but this sort of, are you hearing any echoes in this discussion that relate in some way to work that you've been doing at Sasaki, as far as kind of openness to multiple types of users and keeping in mind different kinds of communities in your work?
Yeah, absolutely, on multiple fronts. I mean, I'm thinking particularly we're working on the second phase of the coastal resilience strategies I mentioned for East Boston and Charlestown, and we're just starting out right now with the sort of visioning process with the community. So we're really, with our community advisory board and our first kind of steps of public engagement. But I think, we've been doing a lot of soul searching, along with our colleagues at the city about, how can we make space to sort of co-envision what the future could look like. That's a really optimistic future, both in terms of being protected from climate threats and also in terms of, adding vital spaces that build on the kind of amazing network that's there today. And always in conversation with the community, it comes up, how do we ensure that we're the ones who are able to, use these spaces and not that it leads to green gentrification or displacement. So I love what you're saying, Andres, about the pairing of, strategies around affordability and housing and park investments, because I think the parks alone can't solve this issue, but they really are. In order to create a more equitable distribution of great amenities, we really do need to target some of these neighborhoods.
I mean, I was happy yesterday to, as part of Design Week, to be in on or listen to a presentation by one of your colleagues actually at Sasaki, talking about the new plans for redoing City Hall Plaza, which obviously, by its nature and very symbolically, needs to be a place where, all citizens in this area temporarily or permanently need to feel like they are welcome, and that it can be a place for protest or, place to hang out, or a place for them to come and kind of feel as part of the civic fabric in a way. And I did feel like there was a lot of attention that was certainly being paid to making the space not just a single use space. It was a place
Yes.
where lots and lots of different people of many different kinds would not only feel comfortable, but would even be able to access it, because it was notoriously a place that, people with mobility issues just couldn't make their ways around. And so,
Absolutely.
I suspect in your work, those ideas are much more infused in everything you do than they used to be. I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's, my colleague Kate, I believe, was talking about her work there and the collaborative work there. But yeah, I mean, I think we're grappling with a lot of the same issues in the work in Fort Point. I think, we had a really wonderful, I think, set of engagement conversations through that process. And I think I saw Irene on the call. She was instrumental in sort of facilitating some of the work that we were able to do with the American City Coalition, where we had sort of, I would say, the usual suspects attend some of the city, open houses pre-COVID, like the last time I was with a big group of people. But then we really were able to target conversations, with folks in Roxbury and Dorchester who don't necessarily use the waterfront today, but who could. And we had some great discussions around what would attract you. And it was everything from, the ability to have an itinerary that once I make the trip, keeps me there all day. Affordable food and places to prepare food, grills, and just generally, I think the sense of creating places that I felt comfortable, that I saw a mix of people, others who look like me, others who don't, and that I was invited to stay, that it wasn't a pass-through space. And then that gets overlaid with, thinking about resilience and creating landform to protect the edge. And then how do you create universal accessibility, which, is a challenge because of the topography that's required. So I think, I would say probably in the work across the city, we're grappling with these overlaid issues. But I think if they can really come together in a synthetic way, you can have, hopefully some incredible spaces that come out of it.
Absolutely.
I was reminded that when a number of us who were part of the Boston Harbor Associates were working with the developers of some of the downtown waterfront properties, one of the questions that came up was around whether the Harbor Walk would be a welcoming place for a family to show up with a grill on a Sunday afternoon and to have a barbecue or a cookout. The developers at that point were appalled at that prospect because that was not what they had in mind for the kinds of clientele that they thought the Boston waterfront should attract. But the fact of the matter is, we have young people in Dorchester who've never been to downtown. I remember once putting together an event on Thompson's Island out in the harbor, where we wanted to take 1,000 kids for a summer jobs activity. And it turned out that the majority of them in a waterfront city had never been on a boat. We've got resources, particularly around the waterfront and also in our neighborhoods, that many of our residents simply don't feel welcome to utilize. And they're free. They are public. They are part of our public common ground, part of our infrastructure. And the question is, how do we move forward in developing those kinds of spaces in a way that begins to make them feel welcoming, and not just the exclusive spaces for a limited number of people.
Right. Yeah, and I think of, it's especially difficult in places like the Harbor Walk, where it's very much kind of a public-private partnership, and you're having to kind of negotiate those differing agendas in a way. But yeah, making it something more like one of my favorites, which is like Wollaston Beach and the seawall down along through Quincy, where on any nice day of any given week, I mean, you will see everybody down there and fishing and barbecuing and just hanging out and playing ball. And it's a wonderful place where the community really lives together. And I would love, getting more of that distributed throughout our communities, I think would be a lovely thing. I do want to make sure we get time for some questions. Because we do have to be out of here by 5:30 with a hard stop, unfortunately. But one quick last question or not even a question, just kind of a chance to say something nice at the end, which is just kind of looking forward, in this topic, what are some specific things that each of you would love to see happen in Boston environments? What kind of development would you personally really think is a wonderful thing for our city's future? Just to close with a little bit.
I'm happy to start very briefly. I think my sort of dream for Boston's future actually exceeds the city boundary and looks at the greater Boston. And I think the greatest change has been triggered by automobiles on any American city, but Boston is no exception to that in the 20th century. And I would love to see that the future growth of Boston will instead fan along the commuter rail corridors into the former mill towns and become a city where you can ride the train in, across all spectrums of society and have a world-class public transport system, not just commuter rail, but then you connect to the T and the bus system, et cetera, and then really provides a sort of seamless and dignified experience for all to get around without needing to have a personal car.
Nice.
I'll follow up on that and say, I hope it's two things. One, the continued evolution of Boston as a biking city. I bike almost everywhere, and have lived in the city at different points of time without a car. And I just hope that we continue to see some of that evolution. There's been a lot of positive improvement in Boston as a biking city. That being said, I still think it's people who are very comfortable biking who bike a lot, and how do we kind of widen that pool? And the other thing I'll add is really future is, I think we only scratch the surface on what people are willing to do seasonally in colder weather. And I personally have sat outdoors in patios in the last several months in temperatures I wouldn't have considered walking around outside in, much less dining. And so it is my hope that we realize that just because the temperature gets cold doesn't mean we have to huddle indoors. And I think that unlocks lots of potential across the city in really, really unique ways. And I hope this past winter was only the beginning of what is an evolution of how we think about winter in Boston.
I'll echo what Jonathan said about this being an all-weather city. You know, we have no qualms about sitting outside when it's cold in Amsterdam or Paris or what have you, and yet in Boston somehow we feel as though we have to run inside. And in the same vein, I would say that what I'd like to see is active implementation of all of the things that we said we learned because of COVID. The way we work, the way we use open spaces, the way we learn, the way we have access to health, the way we access education. We say we have learned a lot from COVID. And yet I hear a lot of people saying, oh, I want to return to normal. And normal does not reflect what we've learned under COVID, either in terms of planning or programming of our public spaces. And I think that we have an opportunity, particularly with federal money likely to come out of Washington for infrastructure improvements, to actually implement in transformative ways many of the things we've learned.
Right, yeah, definitely. Kenan, what about you? Any sort of dream projects you can think of for Boston?
Yeah, I would love to see, you know, continued investment in climate resiliency in both our interior and exterior spaces, because I think one thing that sort of guarantees within that process is a more equitable distribution of resources across the city. So making sure we have the social infrastructure in place. We spoke of bathrooms during this discussion, for example, but also facilities for emergency situations too, where we might have a flooding impact or a heat island event, for example, where people can go to cool off. And, you know, I think framing it in that way automatically brings in a new kind of social infrastructure and support system in that way. And so the partnership of those with design, I think, is also key, because, you know, we also spoke a little bit about the indicators of design of what publicness is or what civic is. And continuing to evaluate that relationship and evolve it, I think, will be crucial in Boston.
Awesome. Laura?
Yeah, you took mine, Kenan. I was going to say, I'm going to say it in a different way, though. You know, I think when you think back to Olmsted's legacy, you know, this ability to really think at the systems level and think about, you know, the hydrology as an organizing system for the park system of Boston, like, I'm really excited about the next iteration of that, which is this network of resilient spaces, right? Which are both waterfront and, as you say, you know, interior spaces that respond to both stormwater flooding and heat. But the opportunity that we have to think about those as a system and not as single, you know, donuts around buildings, development by development, but to really have them work at the sort of city resilience level, but then also to meet the sort of micro needs of the neighborhood, I think is a really exciting opportunity.
That's all great. These are all things we'd love to see implemented, I think. And so with that, I would love to take at least a couple of questions while we have time. First of all, there's one from Greg Gaylor, who many of you know, who is very active in Boston and sort of historic preservation and things like that. Greg asks, what about the studies that talk about the way we subconsciously or psychologically respond to design? Human scale and face-like references in facade design, for example, more typical in historic buildings than in many modern ones. Do these aspects make the public realm more comfortable and used? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, you know, when tourists come to Boston, more often than not, when they get out into the neighborhoods, whether it's the Back Bay or Beacon Hill or the South End, it's because they want to see the more human-scaled buildings that are part of our historic spatial infrastructure. People, by and large, with the possible exception of the Hancock building, by and large, people don't come to Boston because they love to see our tall buildings. And so and I think it's absolutely essential that we maintain a commitment to human-scaled neighborhoods and developments. That means even when we approve a housing development, for example, on Dorchester Avenue or in East Boston, that we look for a scaling of that development that may change some of the scale in the neighborhood, but does so in an evolutionary way, and that recognizes that plazas and access to ground floor spaces that are welcoming are an important part of what gives Boston its character.
Great. Well, we also have one more question I think we have time for from Leslie Friedman, which touches a little bit on something we were just talking about. She says, we have very smart architects, planners, et cetera, on this panel and throughout Boston. Given that, how did we get such a disappointing Seaport full of glass boxes, few public spaces, and not welcoming to me, a senior white woman, not to mention members of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other communities? And I would embroider on this a little bit more. It actually gives us a chance to talk about something we touched on earlier before, which is also, are there ways we can retrofit neighborhoods that don't have enough of these kinds of public amenities with them at this point? So I might combine those two questions just as our final parting thing, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I have to jump on the first part of that because there's a tendency to forget that the Seaport used to be abandoned railroad yards and parking lots. And that the reason it was developed the way it was developed was that Boston needed to enhance in significant ways the tax base of the city. And the easiest way to do that, the most expeditious way to do that was to build what was in fact built. And those buildings, as much as many of us may not love those buildings throw off huge tax revenues that now make it possible for the city to build new firehouses and new libraries and to respond to COVID without raising taxes and to do a lot of things that we could not do before the waterfront was developed as a tax enhancing resource. Mm-hmm. That being said, I also believe that it's possible to retrofit a lot of what has gone on there in ways that make the neighborhood much more welcoming and accessible. And I look to my peers on this panel in terms of the ways that can be done.
Anybody else with suggestions about quick and easy fixes for if there were such a thing?
Quick and easy, right, for the Seaport. But I think the Seaport model also points towards a design challenge that you see in any city that or city or neighborhood that comes from zero, which is there's no point of reference for who will be using the space and how, right? It's a lot easier to work within existing context because you can get a lot more contextual information in terms of space usage, for example, needs in relation to other places. And so what I think is interesting and is an opportunity within the Seaport is we do have a large open space network when you think of that as a percentage of land area in comparison to some of our other neighborhoods. So that's an amazing opportunity to retrofit that to better serve and indicate that these are public spaces moving forward.
So in a sense, it's I think we do need to unfortunately finish up at this point.
I'll just offer 1 minute and say I think the Seaport is both fairly and unfairly criticized. I think the issue of making it feel more welcoming to all Bostonians, regardless of where you live, what you look like, what you do, is the fundamental challenge. And I think to Ted's point, there's some opportunities to retrofit. But I also would argue there's some amazing public spaces down there like Martin Richard Park, A Street Park, the evolution of the Harbor Walk, Fan Pier Park, Q Park. And the problem is that it's still really disjointed. And I think you need this to be more fully built out to start to realize there'll be this amazing new connection from Summer Street all the way down to the water. And so I think it's calling, I think what we need to properly do is call out where areas where we're lacking, but acknowledge it's judging a painting before it's fully finished. And I think we have lots of opportunities and are working really, really hard. And that's what Sasaki's doing with us down in the 4 Point waterfront analysis, to make sure that we get it right as it goes. And so I think there are some real successes down there. I think there's some failures, and I think there's lots of opportunity to continue to evolve it.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to look at it, Jonathan, which is, you know, we've got a developed area there now, and now it's incumbent on us all to kind of figure out what is the neighborhood that wants and needs to be. And so, Andres, I hate to cut you off, but we actually do have to get off before 5:30. So unfortunately, I'm afraid this wraps things up. I wish we could continue the conversation. Maybe next year we'll be able to do it again, which would be awesome. This has been recorded for anybody who wants to listen to it later, or if you have friends who weren't on today who would like to see it, check back at the event page on Boston Design Week website in a week or so to find that link. And now I would just also say, please, if you're on this and want to hang around, come back at 6 p.m. for the 2021 Boston Design Week Awards, which are the capstone to this week and a half of events. But for now, unfortunately, on behalf of myself and these 5 wonderful people, whom I thank very, very much for being here, I wish all of you a very pleasant rest of your Friday and a truly lovely weekend to come. Thank you so much again, and goodbye. Talk with y'all later.